Maya scrolled, and with each flick of her thumb, the weight on her chest grew heavier. It was a familiar ache, this feeling of being left behind while the world moved forward without her. On the screen, a friend stood beaming at the finish line of a marathon she didn't know he was running. The next photo showed another, keys in hand before a shiny new front door. Their lives seemed like a straight, sunlit path. Hers felt like a tangled, overgrown trail she couldn't find the map for. The internal noise started, a low hum she knew too well. Why not me? I should be there by now. I'm doing something wrong. Her own morning. The stack of unread emails, the lukewarm coffee, the quiet apartment, felt inadequate, a flawed draft compared to their polished final copies. The problem wasn't her life itself, but the constant, exhausting work of measuring it against everyone else's. This was Maya's habit, her trap. She measured her raw, unedited reality against the curated perfection of everyone else's highlight reels. She compared her behind the scenes, the fatigue, the doubts, the messy kitchen, to their final filtered cuts. It was a distortion that stole the color from her own world. While a friend posted a single triumphant photo from a year-long project, Maya lived the hundreds of hours of doubt that led to it, yet she never saw his. She was trying to run a race on someone else's track, following a map drawn for a different destination entirely. The exhaustion wasn't from her own journey, but from carrying the heavy, invisible measuring tape she used to size herself up against every passing life. She thought the weight was her failure to keep pace, but the weight was the tape itself, a cold, relentless tool of judgment she could never put down. It made her own small, steady progress feel like standing still. A flower she had nurtured for weeks could bloom in her window, but her eyes were glued to a screen showing a distant, sprawling forest, making her single blossom feel insignificant. The noise of comparison was a constant static, drowning out the quiet music of her own unfolding. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. A rare, perfect beam of afternoon light fell across her desk, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a small, beautiful moment, a gift of quiet grace. But Maya didn't see it. Her head was bent over her phone, her brow furrowed as she scrolled through a former colleague's photos from a vacation she could never afford. She was mentally calculating, comparing, feeling the familiar squeeze of lack. When she finally looked up, the light had shifted. The moment was gone. A profound sadness washed over her, not about the vacation, but about the lost sunlight. She had missed a real, peaceful joy in her own life because she was busy coveting a pixelated version of someone else's. In that quiet sadness, a decision crystallized. She had to put the measuring tape down. The fear was immediate and sharp. If I stop looking sideways, I'll fall behind forever. But the alternative, missing her own life, was a far greater loss. She placed her phone face down on the desk. The action felt terrifying and powerful. She closed her eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. She focused on the only thing that felt real, the solid feeling of her own feet flat on the floor. She noticed the lingering warmth where the sun had been on the wood. She breathed in again, slower this time, and the air that filled her lungs felt different. It was clear. It wasn't filled with the dust of someone else's path. It was just air. Her air. In that first clean breath was a tiny, fragile sense of possibility, the quiet strength of choosing to look inward instead of sideways. Maya began to think of her life as a small, singular garden she was meant to tend. It was not a sprawling forest to be envied or a manicured park to be compared against. It was her plot of earth, with its own unique soil composition, its specific need for sun and shade. The practice was simple but profound. Stop staring over the fence and pick up her own watering can. She started to notice the small growth that had been invisible before. The simple satisfaction of a clean kitchen counter after a long day. The steady rhythm of her breath during a morning walk, a rhythm that was entirely her own. The way a difficult work problem began to unravel after she slept on it. A quiet victory no one would ever post about. This was the patience her timeline required. There was no rushing a rosebud to bloom or a seed to sprout. It happened in its own time, with consistent, gentle care. The strength she found was not loud or boastful. It was the quiet strength of showing up each day, to water her own roots, to pull the weeds of doubt when they appeared, and to simply trust that growth was happening beneath the surface, even when she couldn't see it. She realized her path had its own internal logic, a mysterious and beautiful unfolding that made no sense when viewed from the outside looking in. A delayed promotion wasn't a failure. It was time for her roots to grow deeper, strengthening her for a different kind of wind. A quiet weekend alone wasn't loneliness. It was the necessary fallow ground for new ideas to take root. She was learning to read the secret language of her own journey. The effect was cumulative, built day by quiet day. The noise of comparison, once a deafening roar, began to fade into a distant murmur. It was a noise she had fed with her constant attention, and now, starved of that fuel, it lost its power. In its place, moments of genuine contentment began to surface. She'd be stirring soup on the stove, the kitchen window dark with evening, and a feeling would settle over her, not of lack, but of enough. This is my life, she would think. And it is good. She understood, in a way that felt cellular, that her journey could not be rushed. It was a path she had to walk at her own pace, feeling each stone beneath her feet, not sprinting blindly toward a finish line someone else had set. The desire to replicate someone else's success fell away, replaced by a curiosity about what her own unique version of success might look like. It was a quieter thing, perhaps, less photogenic, but it felt true. The lightness was the most surprising change. It was the sensation of carrying only her own weight, her own hopes, her own dreams. She had put down the heavy burden of everyone else's expectations, everyone else's timelines, everyone else's definitions of a life well lived. She was no longer a traveler weighed down by borrowed luggage. She carried only her own pack, and it felt light because everything in it was hers. She could move through her days with a new focus, her energy directed inward, toward the nurturing of her own spirit, rather than outward, in a constant, exhausting scan of the horizon for validation or threat. The peace she found was not the absence of challenge or doubt. Those still visited. The peace was in the newfound space between the challenge and her reaction to it. In that space, she now had a choice. She could choose to compare, or she could choose to return. To return her gaze to her own hands, her own breath, her own small, steadily growing garden. This became her practice, her quiet rebellion. Each morning, she made a conscious choice to look at her own path first. She used her breath as an anchor, a simple tether to the present moment. When the old habit of comparison arose, as it sometimes did, she acknowledged the thought without judgment. She noticed the pull, the familiar ache, and then she gently turned her attention back to her own breath, her own goals, her own 2 feet on the ground. The victory was not in never comparing. The victory was in the steady, patient act of returning to herself again and again. This practice built a quiet confidence in her own direction, a trust in her unique rhythm. Maya realized peace was never about catching up. It was about the quiet strength of honoring her own timeline. She now walks her path with a steady focus, feeling the lightness of her own journey. I encourage you to try letting go of that heavy measuring tape. Feel what it's like to carry only the weight of your own unique story,